Hey guys, Captain Nostalgia here for Victims and Villains. Victims and Villains is a unique podcast because it educates and engages its listeners on mental health awareness and suicide prevention through the lens of pop culture and the various mediums that lie within that umbrella. And we are so thrilled to partner with All the Horror 2020, which is a celebration of both the genre and the community. We are honored to be among such great podcasts, including our guest for this episode, School-of-schlock. So please, after you guys get done checking out this episode, please go check out all of the podcasts that make up All the Horror 2020. Without further ado, this is our All the Horror episode. We hope you guys enjoy. Welcome to the show where we talk nerd, we talk hope,
and speak nothing else. I'm your co-host, Mark Moore.
I'm your other co-host, Captain Nostalgia, and this is episode 336, where we are talking about 1994's Brainscan.
Imagine a game that knows your fears, fulfills your fantasies, and owns your mind. Now, imagine the game is real.
Play it, Michael.
Brainscan, the ultimate head trip. Rated R. At theaters April 22nd.
And so for this episode, we have brought on a couple of gents that love to talk about crappy B-movies, and so bad that they're good films. Please help me in welcoming from the School-of-schlock, Tom and Ryan.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Yes. Very excited to be on.
I'm not sure how I feel about the reputation we're apparently building.
What else is our hosts of a B-movie podcast going to be known for, Ryan? This is what we do.
Well, you know, that's a fair point. And, you know, someone's got to watch them.
So I guess I've kind of given you guys a segue into talking about the show, but tell us a little bit about what School-of-schlock is all about.
Okay. School-of-schlock was, we decided in about 2016 that there was a niche for talking about B-movies, schlocky movies, cheesy movies, some of the worst movies that have ever been created, and doing fairly serious deep dive reviews on them. Understanding that they are bad and trying to talk about why they're bad, but also pulling out any potentially good elements from them, and also getting into some degree of social issues that the films might deal in, because a lot of these films that we watch are older 1950s, 1960s films. So there's a lot of stuff about things like, you know, gender and racism and all kinds of stuff that are just baked right into a lot of these films. So we figured there was a lot to talk about there too. And it was just, I think, you know, I came to it originally because I was a big fan of Mystery Science Theater 3000, where, you know, the show where they make fun of these B movies. And so I wanted to get in there and just start talking about some of these films.
Well, and that's why he came to me, because he knew that I also liked Mystery Science Theater 3000, and he was, you know, he was looking for someone to suffer through these movies with. I've always been a film buff my entire life. I grew up on all kinds of classic cinema, and so it was a welcome opportunity to kind of do our own little version of Mystery Science Theater. Plus, you know, kind of as Tom was saying, you know, it's nice to actually try to pick these movies apart and understand them better and really get into the nitty gritty of why they're bad. I mean, making fun of them is easy, but trying to understand them is so much harder. And but it's a fun exercise, and I mean, we're clearly getting something out of it because we've been doing it for 4 years. So
That's true.
we haven't gotten sick of doing it yet, and goodness knows there are plenty of movies for us to keep reviewing. So
This is true.
Yeah, we've also kind of dipped our toes every now and then into the world of quote unquote bad cinema, and this year episode 300 for us was celebrated by watching Tommy Wiseau's The Room.
Ooh.
And
we haven't. We keep telling ourselves we need.
We
to do
also
that.
want to do that as like one of our anniversary or kind of major milestone number episodes. That's been talked about.
It's funny because that conversation ended up actually getting fairly deep. And so I think that people kind of look at these horror movies like Brainscan or any of the other movies that you guys have covered. I know we went back and forth talking about The Mummy 2017 more recently with one of your episodes on Twitter, and there can be actually a lot of unintentional depth that I think some of the writers and directors don't intentionally intend to bring on. We recently just also did Showgirls, which is also a terrible movie. But it's entertaining enough to where it makes up for it. And we ended up getting fairly deep on that episode as well. And so what are some of the issues that you guys or some of the more talked about social issues, but what are some of the themes and deeper themes that some of these movies have brought you guys into past episodes?
I would say one of the things that we see consistently with our older films, which is completely unsurprising, but I think it really gives you some context for that there is a lot of, for example, baked-in sexism in films when we're dealing with a lot of the films from the, like I said, from like the 60s. And and this is sort of inherent in the kind of genre too, right? A lot of these films are were kind of mass produced and were supposed to be purposefully sort of exploitative, right? I mean, this is where the grindhouse films and exploitation films and everything kind of came from. But then, of course, inherent in that is exploitation. So you see a lot of that in these older films. And I think where we found it most interesting is where all of that happens more subtly, right? Where things like a woman might be brought on as a scientist character, where there's a group of scientists that are, talking about how to solve there's a, giant praying mantis that's attacking cities right across the United States. One of those types of monster movies. Yeah. And you bring on a woman who is ostensibly a scientist and is on the level with these men, but in the movie that translates into she gets coffee for them. And she is never the source of any of the solutions.
Right.
She's almost always existing just to be put in danger, right? That's her role. She gets put in danger. She makes the men coffee and snacks, and that's pretty much it. And maybe she does not have to go through any kind of what you would see in more exploitative films, right? Maybe she is never half undressed or something, or something like that. But her role is necessarily lower than all of the men who she is working with and supposed to be as good as in this movie. It's that kind of thing. You see a lot of that in these films. So that's something that comes up not in every episode, but it comes up very regularly, is talking about the way in which sexism sort of appears in a lot of these films.
Right, absolutely. And I think more broadly, kind of to the point that Tom is, to the question that you're asking, and in the vein that Tom is in, probably the most interesting thing for me is seeing the subtleties of all of these kind of, seeing the subtleties of how, there was this kind of lack of perceptivity, they weren't perceiving the nature of their own kind of implicit biases. That's the phrase I want. Sorry, I was struggling for it. But there's a lot where things like subtle sexism, right? Where it's in there, it's the little things like that somehow fall into a blind spot. Like, we looking back see it for what it is, and it's interesting to see where those blind spots were when the filmmaker clearly didn't think that they were doing something exploitative, or didn't have the explicit intention. Like, in our first 10 episodes, we reviewed Dr. Sex, and that's very obviously exploitative. I mean, the title itself tells you what you're getting into, and then the movie delivers on exactly the expectations you might have of a film made in 1956 by the name of Dr. Sex, right? Like, so you go into a movie like that knowing exactly what you expect to see, and it is exactly what you expect to see. Now, of course, that's as Tom was pointing out, those are the kind of very extreme examples where the filmmaker is making no bones about it. But of course, everyone was still comfortable with it because that type of exploitation was seen as passable. The interesting things for me are where we see that they clearly didn't understand or didn't think that there was something to take away from it. Or that there was not take away from it, but there wasn't a problem. The subtleties that get embedded in the cultural biases of the people making the movies, right? So the kind of the implicit sexism of a female scientist who doesn't seem to do any science, but we don't think the filmmaker doesn't think that they're doing anything objectionable because, but the woman's still a scientist. I'm being progressive, right? Or you imagine that that's how that conversation might proceed. We've also had other films where we're pretty sure we've seen examples of like blackface and other kind of, again, to a modern eye, very glaring examples of where you're seeing it really is looking back on, filmmaking and seeing where, oh my God, and being kind of having thrown into sharp relief this very obvious and telling symptom of our own implicit cultural exploitative norms and biases. But at the time they were like, they clearly didn't see the problem, and you see it in the way the film is made, right? No one thinks about it. No one discusses it. No attempt is made to really investigate what's going on. And we have had a couple movies where they at least try to pay lip service, and those are the other one. And that's kind of like a whole other category where, you have characters who seem to want to pay lip service to these kinds of exploitative behaviors, but then ultimately it's all in the service of a very kind of bias and highly charged way of making a film. So it is interesting to look back on these films with something of what you might call like an objective lens, I suppose, or as objective as we can achieve, right? And say that, and not like pass judgment or anything, but try to look at it and go, wow, look at the things that we were doing. And how do we understand why they were doing those things? And asking those sort of more critical questions is what I find interesting about it.
And it's interesting to see, in particular, the way that women, to kind of jump off of what Tom was talking about, are depicted in these older movies. Recently, my wife and I went and saw Bride of Frankenstein at a drive-in, and when you go back and you watch those, that film and the original Invisible Man, to me, stick out as women that are just portrayed as hysterical,
right?
Or just completely like one note, or like very, very one-dimensional. And it's how that they were portrayed. And it's interesting to me that you have movies that are revered as these classics, but yet still have these glaring issues that, by modern audiences' standards, like, we want to change them. And I think this movie that we're talking about here today kind of also kind of suffers from that. The Kimberly character is very one note. I remember the first time I saw that, like, she was my biggest issue, is because, like, I was like, why does the film feel compelled to make this character such a prominent role throughout the course of this movie?
So, well, one thing I wanted to mention earlier while y'all were talking is you were talking about the biases like women and the roles that they serve, the roles that they were in other movies. When you look at the culture at the time, and even in the industry, even as late as the 90s and early 2000, Gillian Anderson in the X-Files, she regularly talked about how on set she wasn't allowed to stand in front of David Duchovny and various. She was never allowed to upstage him for the first few seasons until basically the audience had so much mail sent in that they finally started letting her carry as more of a co-main character, as opposed to just assisting the story. So that's not something that ever really went away very fast until audience started to demand a little more.
Right.
And I just thought that was interesting, listening to the various comments about older movies. They're a reflection of the time and the industry that they're trying to show more of what we're at today. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, and even this year and last year, right, with the Me Too movement, I mean, clearly what you're seeing demonstrated is that these things are systemic, right? And systemic even today. That we're still combating these very heavily reinforced kind of societal norms that are obviously very negative and very unhealthy for a number of reasons. But
you couldn't make a movie like Richard Pryor's The Toy from the 80s. You couldn't make a movie like Blazing Saddles. It would never make it out of production. And it's because of the portrayals of various things. The toys, a rich white kid basically rents a black guy to be his toy for a while. In the 80s, it was a funny movie. Today, you'd never get off the ground. So it's just something interesting that comes to mind when you think about the progression of movies and various roles of characters and how they were portrayed throughout time and cinema.
And to the broader point, the films that we review so much for our podcast are what people who were making films, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s were what many of them grew up with as their standard cinema. And so, there's a broader point about the way in which movies kind of inform people's attitudes, and then that just replicates on down the years. And so you see those attitudes still occurring, still being presented, still existing in the industry.
So I want to just segue into kind of our general thoughts on Brainscan, but I feel like this movie is obscure enough to where we should probably do a brief synopsis just to kind of let people know where this is about. You guys, right now, as of this recording, you guys can rent this movie from Amazon Prime or Vudu for, I think it's like $2.99, or you guys can currently stream it right now for free with ads on Crackle. Mr. Mark, how would you describe the plot of Brainscan?
Yes, how would you describe the plot?
How would I the ultimate video game experience, beamed directly to the brain.
Oh no.
How else would you describe that movie?
I feel like that's
one or the other.
I feel like that's fair because we're not into this quite spoilers territory yet, so fair.
I don't know how else to describe it. Edward Furlong, you get it.
Man, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But Mark, while I got you here, man, you've been a little bit quiet. So, general thoughts on this movie?
All right. So Brainscan, I actually thought it was pretty cool. I liked it. It was 90s cheese, and I have a soft spot for 90s cheese. Edward Furlong is the same character Edward Furlong always is. Yeah, it's Trickster was a lot of fun in that movie. I enjoyed it. So that was me.
I'm going to turn it over to our guest as well. And Tom, why don't you go ahead and give us your general thoughts on Brainscan?
You know, Brainscan made me feel a lot of nostalgia because that was right in a time, I mean, 1994, I was 10 years old at that point. And so the whole CD-ROM thing and like using that to go into a crazy VR world, right? I mean, that just hit this kind of sweet spot for me in terms, and then all the grunge music that was playing. It was very much for me like this hit of nostalgia. I just wanted to see if I could find an old Encarta 95 CD and throw that into a like just an old computer and with a big old one of the giant monitors, because that's when I was first starting to really get into and get onto computers. So to me, this movie just that was the biggest thing I took away from it. Was it just felt very nostalgic to me. Suddenly I was thinking about watching Nickelodeon, and like I read somewhere that this film, so this was just on some comment, maybe IMDb or something, this reminded at least one person of an Are You Afraid of the Dark episode with the with just nudity, swearing, and a little bit of gore thrown on top of it. And I couldn't get that out of my mind after I read that comment, because it kind of did feel that way. It felt like a slightly more grown up Are You Afraid of the Dark? It was, I think I ultimately had fun with the film, especially, I'll reiterate Mark's point, the trickster. I think that was a fun character. There was just so much energy brought to that role, and I think the film desperately needed that. So that I think the combination of nostalgia and the trickster character really helped me enjoy the film.
Yeah, and the music was awesome, because I was an 80s original. So when they started playing the music and stuff like Pitch Shifter and Old White Zombie and stuff, I was like, sweet. I remember that stuff coming out. I was around. I was a teenager, beginning of Nirvana. So the music in the movie was just fantastic for me when I was getting into like hard rock and heavy metal.
Oh man,
you're not wrong.
Wild. Yeah, well,
great soundtrack here.
This movie is so characteristic of the time period it was made. You know, it's like I can definitely get on board with the feeling of nostalgia, because just seeing like the kid dialing his phone through his computer, and oh, how cutting edge. That's how we're supposed to know that he's like really avant-garde, this kid, and you know, the grunge music and this, that, and it's it definitely has if you are, you know, like if you were alive for that time period or remember that time period at all, this movie hits a lot of notes that really kind of ring true, because this was very much 1994 for sure. You know, so it's, you know, I guess, I will say that I agree with the assessment of the trickster. I think he's probably the most interesting part of the film. He's definitely the most energetic part of the film. The rest of it, I mean, like, normally I don't have anything bad to say about Frank Langella, but even he in this movie seemed kind of like dull, comparatively speaking. My biggest thing about the film, for whatever it's worth, was that at the end of the day, I didn't feel surprised by any of it. I sort of, A lot of its story notes for me were things that I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's more or less exactly what I thought was going to happen within reason.
Ryan, are you saying
yeah.
when the trickster said, well, don't you know? Well, can I do spoilers now? I'm sorry, I don't
No,
know.
we have not gotten to spoilers yet.
Okay,
So.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna
then
stop my thought then.
Yeah, no, we I'll leave it off at as a general comment there for now. Then knowing that, but certainly, I walked away from the film kind of just thinking to myself, well, it didn't really catch me off guard with any of its major decisions. And it's and take that for what it is. I mean, the movie still definitely has some interesting moments for sure. So it's not exactly to disparage those moments. I just found myself kind of not surprised by the film or by the storyboard of the film overall.
I feel like this movie in particular is exactly as you guys described your podcast. Like, there's a niche audience for this. And
Yeah.
I feel like you're going to watch this movie, and if you didn't grow up in the 90s, if you didn't have like any frame of reference for hard rock or awesome like video games and even to an extent like a love of horror, you're going to hate this movie. But I think the trickster makes it so much more fun than it really is. But it is like a time capsule, and it's not necessarily inherently a great movie, but it's a fun movie, and I love coming back to watching this movie, simply for the trickster, and I love the plot of it. I just wish that there was a better actor at the center of it, because Edward Furlong plays as Mark said, Edward Furlong. Like, to me, I feel like he didn't really bring a whole lot of emotional depth to T2, but he's never really kind of gotten past Terminator 2, in my opinion. And this film is riddled with plot. This film is riddled with just narrative issues and characters being very one-note, as we were talking about earlier. But we're going to take a quick commercial break, and then we're going to jump in to spoil the crap out of this 1994 movie. So we'll be right back. If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now, and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Welcome back to Victims and Villains, and just for those joining us or been listening, we're getting ready to hit the spoiler portion of talking about Brainscan. So we're back. So with this movie, we talk about horror a lot, and horror is always going to fall into a realm of cheese. Almost anything you watch horror big Hollywood budget films to straight to video was going to have its cheese. But what really brings us to the horror movies? What was the experience that brought you to it? I know for me, it was always just trying to find something I found fun, and nothing really did except horror movies. Like comedies over the years have just kind of gotten duller and duller and duller to the point I don't even watch them. I took a liking to horror movies when I was a kid with Poltergeist and Gremlins, and it's just kind of all been downhill from there. So, what y'all brought y'all around to horror movies?
Ryan, I'll have you go first.
Oh, okay. Well, for me, I mean, I have always found horror compelling for a number of different reasons. Mostly, for me, it's I'm a very let me see how to walk this through to root cause effectively. So, I've always found horror very interesting for a number of reasons. At first, actually, I was determined to find a good horror movie. So I've watched a lot of horror movies in my life, particularly probably in the last 10 years. And most of that is the result of having gone through in my early life watching a lot of bad horror movies. And it always seems, and, horror movies never make the Academy Awards, right? You never see them getting nominated for really anything. And I found myself wondering, what does a good horror movie really kind of look like, right? And so I started watching a lot of horror media, but what has ultimately kind of really attracted me to the genre overall, I guess you would say, is, I like the exploration of kind of what not only what makes people afraid, but also what it takes to convey that through a kind of non-personal media, which is an interesting question, in retrospect, that this movie sort of seeks to ask, right? And ultimately try to give a fairly definitive answer for. But in an overall sense, it is interesting to me to watch horror filmmakers try to put together a visual media that gives people a very kind of prosaic sense of unease or discomfort or disquiet, and exploring what the things are that do that to us. What the things are that do that to us that aren't like slasher movies, right? Because, slasher movies are kind of a different genre, and then there's also sort of the quote-unquote torture porn genre, right, which is something else entirely. And like there's a difference between things that disgust us and things that make us afraid. And I've always been interested in that third part of the circle. What are these things that, aren't necessarily really violent, aren't necessarily really grotesque, but are still things that leave people feeling really uncomfortable, or, checking over their shoulder, or suddenly getting that chill up your, that feeling that everyone's had that feeling, right? When they turn off all the lights in their basement and they're going up the stairs, and then all of a sudden they don't know why, but they absolutely have to get through the door onto the first floor. And so you run up the last 5 or 6 steps. I think we've all had that experience at some point, right? And it's that, right? It's like, what is that? And how do you make a movie that does that? And exploring that is very, very interesting to me.
So I can tell you, Arachnophobia was that one movie for me. I can't watch that without being creeped out.
That is a good one. I like that one. I haven't seen it in a while.
Yeah, my wife saves me from spiders now, to give you an idea. That's like the only horror movie that really kind of creeps me out. I ain't scared to admit it either. She saves me from spiders all the time. But Arachnophobia, I saw it once and I haven't watched it since.
I think for me, and I've shared this before in previous episodes, going through, and horror was always that forbidden fruit because I grew up in a fairly conservative religious household, and movies as a whole really got me through a lot of depression and that like awkward teenage phase of my life. And so when I was of age and I was allowed to kind of, do more adult stuff, I remember going to Blockbuster and renting, just wanting to know about the horror genre. Like, I'd heard about it for so long. Like, I'd heard that it wasn't good. I heard that, you shouldn't watch it. It's going to do stuff to you mentally. And I remember the first horror film that I ever watched was Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. I just remember being left speechless.
It's a good first choice.
I love Alfred Hitchcock. I just remember being like speechless because like I couldn't understand how someone could say something bad. And so then I started working my way through the Nightmare on Elm Street series, and then I realized, okay, Freddy's Revenge. I can understand. Bad horror movies are starting to kick in now, and the further you get down the line of those movies, the worse they get. But for me, I feel like in more recent years, being able to experience things like Us and Hereditary and Midsummer and a lot of just these game-changing horror movies that we've seen in recent years has proven to me that horror as a genre has a lot more to say than I think people give it credit for. And that's kind of one of the reasons that I love continuously coming back to it. Is I just feel like horror is the one genre where literally anything goes. And sometimes it's going to be amazing, and sometimes it is going to end up on the School of Schlock podcast because it's schlocky. It's weird. It's B movies, and sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. What about you, Thomas?
So I am gonna start off by just saying that I'm sort of an outlier, I guess, or well, maybe not an outlier, but an outlier here in the group, because for the fact that we have a B-movie podcast about schlocky movies, including we've reviewed plenty of bad horror films, I actually never considered myself a big horror fan at all. I mean, even up until currently, but I have changed my tune a little bit, and the reason is, when I was young, I was always a big wuss, and to an extent still am. I never liked jump scares very much. I never wasn't a big fan of gore or anything like that. But I do find myself very intrigued by things that are a little more along the lines of thrillers and that kind of the building of tension. And I tend to find that a lot of the horror movies that I'm more interested in kind of walk that line, that thriller horror border. So part of me kind of trying to kind of delve more into horror movies more recently in the past, 5 to 10 years or so, has almost been like, I don't know if anyone else here was like afraid of roller coasters when they were very small. And then eventually you had that one experience where you go on a roller coaster and you, at the end of it, you're like, that was awesome. That was fucking awesome. I need to do that again. That's what I'm looking for in horror movies. And I've started to kind of find, a couple here and there where I feel a little more that way. But I was kind of trying to get over that hump of like, no, I don't like this. I don't like the genre. Not for me. Where I've started to watch things to actually get some of that enjoyment out of it and dig into the stuff that other people who are big horror fanatics like really like about the genre. And so that's kind of where that's my on-ramp onto horror is, seeing some of the, I guess what are considered to be more so the horror classics, things like your Jaws, things like Gremlins, that kind of thing, where I can watch those and be like, these are ones that are kind of held up as like, these are classics. And I can watch them and I can get some of that enjoyment out of it and realize like, okay, I think ultimately what it is about horror is that horror, like heinous shit happens in the real world. And so horror is like a great way to kind of, I don't know, grapple with that. so many other films like action movies and stuff, most of the stuff that happens in action movies does not happen in the real world. You don't have the one guy rescuing the entire city from, this crazy terrorist plot. But horror shit, unfortunately, there's real horrifying things happen every day. And so I think horror movies are an interesting way to deal with that stuff. So that's where I'm coming at it from.
Wait, are you saying the Fast and Furious has lied to me all these years?
No, actually not that one.
That one's
completely true.
Fast and Furious is the only action series that is 100% true to life.
Yeah, no, that one, it's that might surprise some people, but stats don't lie.
So here's a thought. You said you're more on the side of the thriller and suspense side of horror. Have you seen any of some of the Asian horror movies?
I have not. I have not been brave enough to venture into those.
So a lot of your horror movies actually fall more along that line. I just recently watched one for the website. I believe it was called Impetigru, I believe was the name of it. And it deals with a lot of backwoods village superstition in Indonesia. And it falls more along the lines of thriller and suspense without a lot of graphic horror like you've seen in more American stuff like Halloween or the Saw movies. It deals more with the culture and society and their superstitious beliefs and how it builds into like this horror scene through the story. So you might want to check out some of those. Some of the more Asian horror movies, they might fall more in line of what you like as opposed to the big budget Hollywood stuff.
That sounds very interesting. It definitely sounds appealing to me. I would be interested in watching that.
And you can stream it right now from our friends over at Shudder.
Yep. Yeah, Shudder has quite a few thrillers that fall in that line from like Indonesia and various parts of Asia. So that might be something to check out.
I may have to check that out. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
So I really don't want to start here, but I try and always kind of get as much of the negative out of the way as quick as possible when we're doing these movie podcasts. How does everyone feel about the fact that all of this movie was a dream?
It felt like a cop-out.
Not only did it feel like a cop-out, it's like, this is actually one of the biggest things where I was saying it, I wasn't surprised. It's like, well, yeah, obviously. As soon as the main character is the one committing murder, it's like, no. They weren't prepared to commit to a decision like that in 94. No.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Like, when it happened, it felt like a very obvious turn. And it was, for that reason, sort of a disappointing turn at the end. That, it was all just a game. It was all the part of the game, just an extended dream sequence because we have hypnotic CD-ROM technology that's good in 1994. But yeah, like that is just one of those things where they also did the other thing that I feel like you do see in many horror films, at least many of the ones that I have seen, which is the question mark at the end of the film, right? Where they're like, well, but does the dog still have the foot? And also, here's the trickster in the principal's office. Maybe it is real? Question mark.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, man.
No, I was just agreeing.
So the first time that I watched this, I missed out on that post-credit scene. And I was like, oh, they're going to be building something. And then they just do nothing with it. So dumb. But they also, not only with it being a dream, it feels like you guys said, it feels like a complete cop-out. A lot of the boldness that you had established into this movie quickly exits the picture. But even more than that, once he kind of comes back to his senses and he wakes up and it's actually the real world this time. I hate how they basically set up this subplot with Mike and Kimberly, and then she turns him down. I was like, it felt like a complete waste of not only character but story as well. And I hated the whole ending where he gives the principal the brain scan, then it's like, was it a dream or was it really not a dream? Like, what goes on? And if you only have the one disc, like, what happens to the other 3 discs that are mentioned in this movie?
Well, the other 3 discs were all part of the game where he was, I guess, hallucinating everything. They all showed up in the story before he woke up and went, "Oh, it was all in my head." So they were part of the storyline in his head, he was imagining. So there's only the one disc, I guess, to make him hallucinate to begin with.
That's what I assumed as well. It wasn't clear to me. I mean, there was a little dialogue in there that may have suggested that they expected there to be another disc, but prior to him being hypnotized. But that could have just been as part of the hard sell for the hypnosis.
Now, was that actually mentioned before or after he got all the flashy light seizure stuff right at the very beginning?
Yeah, maybe it wasn't. I don't really. I honestly can't firmly enough remember. I could have it out of sequence.
Yeah, because it depends on. I think that scene.
Yeah.
When he went into the game, so to speak. So if anything was done after that, that would have just been part of the game.
Yeah, right. Presumably, based on the way that they set up the game, right? And I totally agree also about the last scene with him and Kimberly. It's like, oh no, it's not a no, it's a maybe. But then I'm gonna kiss you, and then I'm gonna leave, and then you see the weird portfolio of photographs that I've been taking of you. It's like, oh great, they're both spying on each other. That makes it better. I was really happy that not a lot was done with that throughout the course of the film, because that would have gotten really difficult to manage appropriately very, very quickly.
So you're saying you think they managed it appropriately as it was?
Oh yeah, no, I think they did a great job. No.
Even the way that Kimberly is introduced, though, is problematic, because she's basically introduced us as the quote-unquote girl next door, but yet she gives into these fantasies to where she's, like, taking off her bra and, like, taking off her clothes and, like, making sure that Mike is watching, and it's like, this is just weird. Like, why is this character like this?
Right.
The movie doesn't require this character to basically be a one-dimensional caricature of a horror.
So it's part of horror in general. There's always gratuitous nudity for no other reason than to have nudity. And that's pretty much the whole point of that.
Which I think is a great larger point about a lot of what makes bad horror movies bad in general, which is all of them, and even a lot of the bad movies in general that aren't just horror movies that Tom and I watch. They all have this. It's as though the filmmakers were like, I have to stick to the formula. There's a formula and it works, and I have to do it. And that formula says that there has to be a female interest. Okay, and here we go. And this is my execution of the female love interest, because it needed to happen that way, because the handbook said so. And it's like, who wrote the freaking handbook? Why is there a handbook? Why do we care what it says? You could do your own thing.
Also,
well, they started following a lot of formulas with the success of Halloween and Friday the 13th.
Right. That's what exactly right.
And that was like the format for horror movies almost exclusively thereafter.
And I feel like with the Kimberly character specifically, it seems to me like the writers felt like they wrote themselves into a corner with the immediately with our protagonist spying on her, with like that is inherently creepy. If this is the guy we're supposed to be following and we're supposed to kind of feel something for, can we figure out a way to try to make this okay? Well, what if she's kind of doing it on purpose? What if she's into this? And so we show very clearly at the beginning that she's kind of trying to put herself on display. Then we've kind of given ourselves a pass for him being a creep, right?
Right, and whipping out his video camera. And
it feels very weird, though, because all of that problematic issues that exist with her exist before all of the quote-unquote dream sequence is initiated. So that's how you meet her, and then by the time that you get back to that same reality version of her, she's like, no, just not right now. And then he pulls a Lloyd Christmas, and he's like, so you're telling me there's a chance? And it doesn't feel like a cohesive character unit. And I think maybe the writers somehow along the way were kind of like, they didn't understand how to bridge the gaps between the dream world Kimberly and the real world Kimberly.
Right, and so what they opted to do was make them the same person. Like it's such a glaring like hole straight through so many lines of the plot that his, hypnosis driven, hallucination of her takes pictures of him and has a little binder of those pictures on her nightstand. Then real one happens to have that same binder full of pictures on her nightstand. Theoretically, that doesn't really make any sense, but we bought into it anyway. It's as though the filmmaker was like, well, that's as you say, I don't know how to tell the difference, so there is no difference. They're all the same.
I feel like there's also a general problem with like, is it really a wise filmmaking decision to end with something so non-committal? To just be like, well, this character doesn't know how she feels about the main character. There you go, audience. Hope you enjoy that decision or lack of one.
Also, can we talk about how the foliage and the woods surrounding this area are incredibly so thin that when he's out trying to either hide evidence or hide from someone, that magically is like he's got like a cloak of invisibility through like 2 twigs, and we're just supposed to buy that?
Oh yeah. Like when the guy with the dog walks right up to him, looks right at him, and is like, there's probably nothing there. I'm sure it's just my dog being stupid.
He always appears to be just on the edge of the woods. Wherever he is throughout this entire film, he's right on the edge of going into the woods and the outer edge of civilization. So I don't know how that's supposed to work, but he never goes into the woods. He just always stays right there on the edge.
Also, like when he comes out of the trance from the very first game that he plays early in the movie, and right next to him is just a glass of milk that's been sitting out for a couple hours. Who gets that sweaty and they just say, I need milk right now?
I need to chug this glass of warm milk. That'll take it away.
I mean, in the 90s, we weren't really concerned with plot holes. That just never occurred to us.
Touché.
Yeah.
Plot hole? What's that?
Also, just jamming your hand into a plate of food and shoving it into your face. That whole post moment where he is like, oh my God, and he's like rubbing food on his face and drowning in milk. It's like, what is happening? No one behaves this way. I was alive in 94. I remember what it was like. It wasn't this plague-driven madness world that we're seeing on this screen right now.
The only time something like that happened is usually on a dare.
Right. Someone was like, hey, I bet you won't chug this glass of milk I left out for 3 hours and shovel that weird chicken into your face. And you being 12 years old was like, oh yeah, well watch me do it. And then you were sick for a week.
I double dog dare you.
Yeah, right.
It's on
Then
now.
you have to.
Monster.
I don't know. Maybe the writers were trying to get bold, and they were like, maybe if we put milk, and that maybe if that's the only thing this kid drinks, maybe we'll get a sponsorship from Got Milk. Because
Right.
How would you guys like
Got
to help
Milk
us
was
like
like
a huge thing in around the time of the release of this movie?
Oh, yeah,
And
the dairy industry
other
was
events.
booming.
Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today. But I think you
Something-
really... Go ahead, Mark.
Something else interesting, right about the time frame this movie came out, there were two other similar movies that took a different take on almost like a cyber world kind of thing. You had Ghost in the Machine in '93, which was I guess serial killer got stuck in the computers and was going all over town killing people. And then you had Lawnmower Man before that. So in the
Yep.
course of a year and a half, you had 3 computer-based movies like this with very different range of how they were presented.
For sure. Yeah. I've never I've never seen Ghost in the Machine, but I've heard, I do know that that's the plot of it. And you're right. It has a very kind of similar, what happens when technology goes amok type of thing.
Something else I couldn't help but thinking about is the Trickster. He reminded me a lot of Howie Mandel's character in Little Monsters. It's just a more adult version.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And I feel like, though, having never seen Ghost in the Machine or Lawnmower Man, but just kind of looking at the audience that this movie is specifically trying to go after, the copycat movies is not a new idea. We had a few years ago, you had Olympus Has Fallen and White House Down coming out in the same summer. You have just movies that are basically just copying off one another's homework coming out within a few years or a few months of release with one another. There was a Beauty and the Beast movie, and there was a knockoff Beauty and the Beast film that come out a couple months apart from each other a couple years ago. But it feels like this was a movie that they maybe looked at like Ghost in the Machine. They're like, you know what? Let's create a movie that is going to be geared towards teenagers and hard rockers. And that's kind of what it feels like. This was the MO for this movie.
I mean, yeah, very possibly. It's always difficult to tell exactly why they want to. And it happens. It like there's more than a couple instances of it where like very similar movies will come out within 2 or 3 years of each other, or even sometimes in the same year. Things like one of the most recent examples that I always think of is when A-Team and The Losers came out in the same year. It's like, whoops. But I certainly like the idea that they were thinking that there was some segment of the audience out there that was being underserved and needed their own version of that movie that they could really relate to.
I feel like for this movie, though, one of the things that makes it a redeemable, fun time is the character, the trickster. And we talked about it all in our general thoughts. But what is it particular about the performance of T. Ryder Smith that you guys just really fell in love with in this movie? Tom, you've been kind of quiet, so I want to hear from you first.
Sure. So the trickster, I think, just brings much needed energy and I don't want to say comedy, but there's a lightheartedness to his performance that is very much needed in this film. He's got the kind of camera presence and the charisma to pull it off. And he makes for then a compelling villain, right? Especially because really ultimately from a writing perspective, it would be kind of hard. I find the justifications for him continuing to play the additional discs a little hard to swallow. Like he kills a person and it's like, that's it. No more. And then is somehow still convinced by the trickster to play discs 2 and 3 and to keep going. And I think the only way it even comes close to working, those justifications for continuing, is because the trickster plays this charismatic and compelling villainous character that is trying to kind of mess with his head, right? So him just kind of bouncing around the room, basically chewing on the scenery practically, it really helps to kind of bring some sort of focus into the center of this film. Something that this film could have been so dull in the middle and just such a slog. And I think the trickster is the character, like the thing that keeps that from happening.
So I enjoyed how kind of almost flamboyant he was, but it got me. He had the scene where he was talking about nothing could hurt him and showing all this stuff, doing all this stuff to himself. Oh, nothing hurts. And then you get to the end of the movie and he's being hurt by Edward Furlong. Doing the same stuff he said didn't hurt earlier. So that was just a little confusing, but the character as a whole was interesting. And I mean, without him, it'd just been another generic Edward Furlong movie. Yeah. There really wasn't much character to anyone but him. Everybody just kind of seemed dead and flat almost.
I love the way that you describe him as flamboyant, because that is a perfect description of just how that character is handled. And he's very much
wear that jacket and have that hair without being called flamboyant.
He's so larger than life, and I really love that about him. And like Tom was saying, like this movie needs that depth of energy that you don't get from any of the other characters. He is able to really elevate it to a whole nother level that I feel like, as Ryan was talking about, this movie without him isn't watchable. It just feels like a very generic sci-fi movie that, for lack of a better word, would just kind of fall into obscurity. Like, I had never heard of this movie until last year. And
well, like I said, this came out when I was a teenager, started to get into like horror movies and stuff. So I had heard about it. I had just never seen it. It just suffers from everything that an Edward Furlong movie suffers from. Everybody else carries the movie, and the trickster is the one that carries it. In this case, it was Schwarzenegger in T2, Edward Norton in American History X. Anything you put Furlong in, if it doesn't have a good supporting cast, it's going to be horrible. And the trickster was that character in this movie.
He's so good. All right, Ryan, what about you? What do you like about the trickster?
I mean, I feel like I'd be repeating myself a little bit to some extent. Rather, repeating all of you, not repeating myself. Repeating everything that's been said. To elaborate further, but you know, it's Yeah, I mean, it comes down for me. At the end of the day, I actually really like I mean, particularly because in some of those scenes, he quite literally was chewing the scenery. I particularly like the phrase "chewing the scenery" as Tom used to describe him. Without him, or first of all, without him, I think the movie is probably, I don't know, 30 minutes long, but also without him, there's no, yeah, I mean, the movie just has no motive force through its middle, 40 minutes or so. There would be nothing there. It would be Furlong kind of faffing about doing nothing about this predicament in which he sort of suddenly has found himself. Now, incidentally, I actually think that there is a more interesting version of this movie where he is compelled to deal with it himself. But certainly so there's an extent to which adding a kind of a sort of fantastical character to keep the movie moving in a direction and to give it some sense of focus is perhaps a ham-handed device, but in this case is certainly effective. The person who does the role certainly commits to it, which helps, because it is also the case that this role could have been very hard to watch if poorly executed. But I think Ryder does a good job of leveraging the role to make the movie keep moving forward. And provides you with some driving impetus some driving impetus. I feel like a lot of opportunities were missed with the character. I always find myself sort of interested in one of the things that I always find interesting about characters like the Trickster. I can't believe I almost forgot the name. One of the things that I always do find interesting about characters like the Trickster in movies like this is where there is sort of lost potential for the movie to have been better, or to have improved, had characters or certain narrative devices been used to greater effect. And I do think the Trickster falls into that category. I feel like there could have been a much more interesting exploration of, the main character's relationship with this kind of almost hallucination within a hallucination that he begins to experience regularly, that kind of keeps pushing him to commit more murder or to cover up the murders that he has already to that point committed. Ultimately strikes me as unfortunate that they chose kind of the low-hanging fruit version of this character rather than trying to approach a more nuanced version of it. Nevertheless, but I sort of always am interested in those characters where it's like, oh, that was a really great idea. And I do think I think the Trickster is a really interesting and compelling idea in context.
I absolutely agree. And I do wish that you would have gotten more from this character, because it seems like such a poor decision in retrospect that you are dating your film before it even hits video. And you are basically attempting to reach an audience that are, probably 17 to maybe 16, 17 to maybe like 20, 21. Like, that's your demographic that you're trying to reach for people that are into horror movies, people that are into video games, people that are into the heavy metal scene and hard rock and grunge, and like that's the audience that you're trying to appeal to. And that's fine for a 1994 audience, but I feel like this movie gets extremely dated in that approach, because your most compelling asset is used almost as an afterthought. And I feel like it's really weird to kind of call the Trickster almost the villain of this movie, because he is, but the way that the narrative kind of sets him up, he feels more like a wild card asset in this arsenal, and Frank Langella feels more like basically the villain of this movie more than the Trickster does. And we kind of really haven't talked about Frank Langella as of this point yet. How did you guys kind of feel with how his character was handled throughout the course of this?
I think there's a reason we haven't talked about him. It was I feel like his character had almost no impact on the film itself, which is a real shame. What a waste of a good actor. But he's set up as not so much a character, but an inevitable force, right? Just this sort of thing that is coming slowly but surely to catch, kill, whatever, our main character. And even the kind of the trickster presents him that way, like, you're going to get caught. He's going to come for you. There's only, the only way out of this is through. And if you chicken out, you're going to get caught. You're going to get found out. This detective is going to bring you to justice. And that's the way the movie treats him as well. There's no depth of character there, really. He's just a slowly approaching force, I guess. A reckoning, basically. And it seems like a shame because that whole thing is just feels very wooden. It feels like there's nothing there to grasp onto. It's just an approaching inevitability. Which again, yeah, what a waste of a good actor to be in that kind of a position.
He feels like a video game character.
Yeah, you almost described him like Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Without Indiana Jones, the movie still would have turned out the same. Without his character in this movie, the same outcome pretty much would have happened.
Yeah, it does sort of feel that way. It feels like this was the approaching end no matter what, whether or not you had this character and Frank Langella playing that character or not.
So with him as an actor in general, everything I've seen him in, he reminds me of Edward Furlong. He plays the same acting style in every character I've seen him in. So I really didn't have much care for his character at all, even as an actor. I mean, he does a good job at what he does. It's just he always seems to play the same role to me.
Have you seen him in the He-Man movie?
As Skeletor. Because if you haven't...
He was Skeletor in the He-Man movie.
Oh, yes. He was Skeletor in the He-Man. Around the same time, actually, as this, it would have been, right? Or what was it, 89 or 90? Something like that.
Yeah,
it was late 80s.
Yeah.
It was right in this time frame.
Not to plug ourselves, but we watched that for one of our episodes, and it was something.
I always remember him the most as his character from The Ninth Gate. And it's that same kind of monotone, very serious, very straightforward character. I never realized he was Skeletor in He-Man.
Yeah, that was kind of the role that kind of put him on the map, so to say. Yeah, I feel like I agree with everything you guys are saying. Like, he feels like a afterthought for a large portion of this entire film, and I could not help but think on this viewing about the Netflix series Making a Murderer, with his character in particular, the way that he was questioning Mike without a parent or guardian present, but also the same way that he was like sneaking into the house to get the fire ashes, like
to get inadmissible evidence.
Yeah, it's like, come on, dude. Like, I remember like screaming at my television like during this past viewing, because it is, again, it's just one of those plot devices, and then once it's kind of like set up as a dream, his character just becomes void of purpose at all.
Yeah, that was one of the things me and my wife mentioned, was everything he did to collect evidence, supposedly none of it would have been admissible in court because it was all illegally obtained. So it's just like, okay, you just wasted everybody's time by walking in and sifting through a fireplace. Good job.
Right. It's like, but I agree completely. And what he ends up feeling like, I mean, to some extent, is, he ends up feeling like a video game character. He doesn't have a backstory. He doesn't have a plot. He doesn't have narrative development. He doesn't really have a character to speak of. He's just a cop.
And what does he do as soon as he decides he knows? Yes, he has enough evidence.
You're a murderer.
To convict the killer. He just comes in and pulls out his gun and shoots him.
Murderer.
That's the way that police work operates, right? That's how.
Well,
that's
quietly
how
telling him that he's a murderer. Murderer.
Try and intimidate a 16-year-old. Come on, man. So we're going to move on to our mental health moment. This is the point in our show where we pull out a mental health theme of importance because we educate and engage mental health awareness through the platform of pop culture. And there's one scene in particular, though, that one relationship I feel like in particular, though, and you see it really highlighted very sternly, the first encounter that we get between Frank Langella's character and Edward Furlong's character in Mike's house. And he talks about, they really emphasize after the character Kyle, who was Michael's only real best friend, really dying, and really emphasizes that outside of Kyle, Mike was basically a loner. And I feel like it's important to have that one person to always have in your corner, because even if you don't have the accessibility to surround yourself with a large, healthy community, surrounding yourself with one person that you can confide in, to whether it would be in a venting capacity or someone to laugh with, someone to cry with, having one person, whether it's a spouse or it's a best friend, is a huge, significant boost to your mental health, and it's incredibly important to have that support. And so I want to kind of ask you guys, like, how would you guys feel about the importance of just having that one person?
I think not only is it important to have someone like that, I really think that having one person you can confide into can actually help if you are in a difficult situation or have been for a long time. Not only can it then help to have one person to help you out through that, but having one person can also help be a bridge to eventually having more than just that one person, right? Mm-hmm. You can kind of figure out what it is that's special about the connection between the two of you, and you can use that to broaden your connections if you're able to, and start to have a little more of a community around yourself. Maybe if you're one of those people who does not feel comfortable normally, being social with other people, etc., sometimes that one person who you actually have a real connection with right now, they can help you. The two of you together can find community in others as well. There's an extent to which I sometimes feel like I personally can have difficulty like in social situations. But my wife is wonderful, and she is very good at navigating those situations. And so she has been a real help to me in navigating social situations and getting friendships out of that. So sometimes the one person can be a real wonderful bridge into a larger supportive community.
I love the way that you use the analogy of a bridge to intro into a community. I know for my wife and I have been that way to her, because we just recently moved, and we moved to Richmond, and she's lived in Pennsylvania her entire life. And so for the first few years of our marriage, she was that bridge into that world because I was an outsider. I moved into her hometown to be with her, and eventually got connected and plugged in with a church, jobs, stuff along those lines, and then ultimately finding that reversal this past year of being connected into a community with church, jobs, and just a great group of friends down here as well. And so I love that analogy of just having a bridge, because sometimes that one person is going to be a significant cornerstone for you, but sometimes that cornerstone can lead into almost a cave, so to say, of protection and wondrous community past that one person.
So I have my wife. You heard me mention her earlier, and she's kind of always there to back me up when I need it and talk to. But the fun part is she's an introvert and I'm more of an extrovert. So I make her socialize. But yeah, she's the one I talk to about everything and helps figure out ideas. And if she wasn't around, I don't know who I'd really talk to. So we've been together 10 years now, and she kind of makes things easier just because she's there.
So I'm not married. I have a dog. I think my experience of this, is I think it can be easy for people to forget how important the exercise of trust is, just like to any person, right? Because the reality is that for any number, there are a collection of reasons that can lead to someone or any person, thinking or wanting to sort of really recuse themselves from other people. And so many of those things oftentimes are linked to an ability or a desire to trust others. And, having that one person, having a close relationship with someone, a reliable relationship with a person, a dependable relationship is really an exercise of trust. You're entrusting a large part of yourself to that other person for any number of things. And the thing that I think is so important and so critical about that type of thing or having those types of relationships with people, even if it's just with one other person, is trust is healthy, and really, supporting someone who's trying to learn to trust you, or supporting someone who wants to be able to trust you, or you generic, right? You or any other person, being part of that kind of trust is not simply healthy for people, but really is so important to kind of to living your life. I mean, the reality is that it ultimately is enriching and very fulfilling in and of itself, to be able to look at a person or a small group of people or any number of people and say, I trust these people. And knowing that what you mean when you say that is, you are able to depend on them and they're able to depend on you. And, thinking again of the analogy of a bridge, right? It's something that connects the two of you, you to other people in a much more communal and real, tangible, practical sense than people oftentimes are prepared to give it credit for. And so it really emphasizes the very real importance of being able to have that kind of trust for and with other people, from day to day.
Absolutely, and I just want to encourage anyone listening right now that if you need that community, this is why we create this content. Is we want to be that community and that gateway into hope and resources for you guys. So in the descriptions below, you guys will find a link. Click that link. It's victimsandvillains.net/hope, and it'll get you guys access to mental health resources, and both for general audiences and niche audiences alike. Please stay with us. You have value and you have worth, and this is the reason why we create the content that we do, is because we care about you. Even if we don't know your name, we've never been in the same room, or even know you exist, we care about you because your life has value and it has purpose. So please stay with us. And now that this podcast is done, you guys can check out the School of Schlock. Where can people find more information about the podcast?
You can find us on social media. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/school-of-schlock. We're also on Twitter at School of Schlock, spelled SCHLOCK. You can go to either of those places, and of course you can also find us on pretty much any of the major platforms where you can listen to podcasts, whether it be Apple Podcasts or places like Spotify, radio.com, lots of different places.
You guys can find us everywhere at Victims and Villains. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, Letterboxd, and like Tom just said, you guys can also find us on any major platforms as well. And you guys also check out all of the other amazing podcasts that are a part of this year's All the Horror events. And until next time, remember to keep talking nerd, talking hope, speaking nothing else. And we're going away and we're getting ready to play Death by Design. We'll see you guys soon.